Now, a little bit about our guest. Many of you know Charlotte Korshak from our previous crash course or from her work as an educator with Stand With Us. She was born in the US and moved to Israel with her family when she was 9 years old. She lived there for 5 years and was introduced to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict not through an online search, but through living through the Second Intifada as an adolescent. At 13, her city became a war zone, and at 14, 3 of her friends were murdered in a suicide bombing. The conflict was real, not academic. Then her family moved back to the US, and she experienced no anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism through high school. But around month 6 at USC, she ran into an apartheid wall and was called a racist because she felt a connection to Israel. She realized that no one should feel defenseless while their identity is being attacked. So Charlotte spent the next years studying and digging into the complexities of the Middle East. Her goal has been to help others to learn. She worked at Stand With Us for nearly 15 years, where she last served as a senior educator and director of the international student programs. In the past month, she left Stand With Us and founded the Jerusalem Education Institute. JEI will empower participants to deepen their knowledge of Israel and of Zionism. Through engaging presentations and workshops, thought-provoking discussions, and comprehensive resources, individuals will learn to navigate the complexities of the region with accuracy and with insight. Charlotte lives in Israel, also lives in the United States. She has a firsthand perspective of what has changed since October 7th. Please join me in welcoming her live. Charlotte?
Thank you so much, Barbara. It's so great to be back. I still can't believe that it's been 2 years. It really does feel like it was yesterday. And to think about all the things that have happened since, it's hard to really wrap your head around. So we're gonna try to make some sense of it all today. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for attending. I know it's not easy on a Sunday morning, but the amount of people attending is just it's really inspiring. So thank you all so much for being here. And I don't think I need to introduce myself any further. I think Barbara did an amazing job of telling you all my story. And so that gives us a lot of time to dive in to this really challenging topic of what has happened since October 7th in Israel. How has that affected the Israelis, the Palestinians, the leadership in Israel, and Israelis themselves in terms of just their sentiments towards Israel, towards the conflict, towards Palestinians. So with that, I think let's just dive in. And what I'm going to try to do is really give us kind of set the stage for what happened leading up to October 7th, and then, of course, tackle what's happened in the last year and a half, uh, relating to all of the different wars, the different fronts that Israel has been fighting on, the different proxies that Israel has had to fight, and then, of course, their direct interaction with Iran, the first time really ever that we've had any direct conflict with Iran since the Iranian Israeli conflict began all the way back in 1979. As we know, Iran has ever since really conducted themselves via their proxies. And so for the first time, we actually saw a direct strike from Iran on Israel. So let's go back and just talk about the lead up, because the lead up will help us also understand what's happened since. So last time we met, which was January of 2023, that was right as the judicial reforms were being launched in Israel, a huge reform package that ultimately caused tremendous turmoil in Israel. There was mass division, there were mass protests, and there was one solid group in Israel that was very much for pushing forward the reforms as they were laid out. There was one solid group that was fully against the reforms, and then the vast majority of Israelis sat in the middle, about 70% or so, which were for reform, just not fully the full package of reform that was being proposed by the government at the time. This is important. It's important because going into March of 2023, right after our sessions kind of ended, about a month and a half later, we had the an outcry from the defense minister at the time, Yoav Gallant, who said, "This is dangerous. These protests are dangerous. They're weakening the country and they're opening up the country to great vulnerability." And actually, what we learned after October 7th was that the plan to strike Israel, that October 7th plan, that massive strike by Hamas, was actually planned for Passover of that year, which would have been just a week or two after Gallant's warnings, and they were held off by Iran. And so it was there was a lot of awareness of within the military echelon that the protests by military reservists and others were creating the appearance of weakness and potentially actual weakness within the country. And that continued through the summer and, of course, until October 7th. Now, with that, what we had was ultimately a weakened deterrence. One of the things that Israel needs and strives for always is to have enough deterrent towards their enemies so that their enemies do not want to strike Israel. Well, At that point, we had lost our deterrence. There was nothing really stopping these enemies from attacking Israel. And we should also remember that leading up to October 7th, Iranian proxies were at their absolute strongest. We're talking about Hezbollah, who had been armed, trained, funded, and had now combat experience because they had fought in Syria alongside the Assad regime. They were at their highest in terms of their how many ammunitions they had, their capabilities in terms of just their training. They had the Radwan force was essentially the special forces of Hezbollah, which were preparing an October 7th like attack against Israel from the north. They had been digging tunnels. They had an underground bunker that could house over 1,000 people. Hezbollah was by far at their highest. The Assad regime was alive and well, and obviously acted as a base of operation for Iran and gave them the ability to really plant Iranian infrastructure right there on Israel's border in southern Syria. You had Iraqi and Syria, smaller Shiite militias that were also aligned with Iran that also had capabilities and could again strike Israel as we saw them do so post October 7th. And then, of course, down in Yemen, you had the Houthis who had continuously were growing in strength. And as we've seen what they've been doing over the last year and a half, we see how strong they actually are. And then lastly, Hamas. Now, this was something that Israel wasn't aware of, but Hamas was by far at its highest and most capable military, of their highest military capabilities than they had ever been before in the history of the organization on October 6th, 2023. And so we were dealing with a very strong Iran, an Iran that was on its way towards the nuclear bomb. Other than we should remember that Iran was having some internal turmoil, but that wasn't really affecting the regime in terms of their exporting of terror. And that gets us to October 7th, when of course the prime Iranian proxy within proximity to Israel, Hamas, took advantage of the turmoil inside of Israel to strike Israel. And of course, we suffer the worst attack in Israeli history. Now, since that time, what has changed? So, first of all, let's start with Hamas just because they're the most relevant. So, I'm sure that most of us who were watching the first hostage release, and then, of course, the hostage release from yesterday, which first, let's just say, thank God, 7 of our hostages are home and they're on their feet and they're walking. And we can all just be so grateful for that. That being said, I think it was very jarring for many to watch the show that Hamas put on, the show of force, the show of power. We got word that Hamas kept an entire battalion of fighters away from the fighting this entire time so that when a ceasefire would be brokered, that they would be able to emerge in uniform and show a sign of strength. So we have to understand is that what it looks like is that Hamas is still in power and that Hamas still has capabilities. Well, what we need to understand is that Hamas really doesn't have very many military capabilities left. The military threat to Israel is pretty much non-existent today. That being said, they do still have governing and policing capabilities in Gaza. And that's what we're seeing happen. As soon as the ceasefire was called, as it was starting to take effect, we immediately saw Hamas police emerge from the tunnels and begin to take back control of these major cities. What we have to remember is about 20,000 Hamas fighters have been killed at this point, and many others have been wounded. And so, therefore, much of, again, that military capability has been eliminated. That being said, we also have reports from the Americans and others that say that Hamas has also managed to recruit tremendously in the last 6 months. Now, ultimately, what does that mean? They're recruiting people who are not trained. And so yes, they have recruitment capabilities, but the people who are being recruited are not trained like a Nukba fighter or even like somebody who wasn't necessarily special forces of Hamas. So they can still recruit internally, but in terms of the military capabilities to attack Israel are slim to none. We also have to remember that their ammunition supply is running very low, from what we understand from our intelligence. We also cut off their access point to more ammunition. We learned after October 7th is that Hamas was arming themselves through tunnels that were dug underneath the Egyptian border, underneath the Rafah crossing, as we refer to it as. And so that point has been cut off for Hamas to be able to rearm. Israel, of course, is monitoring that area, the Rafah crossing, or in Israeli military terms, what's referred to as the Philadelphia corridor. Now, this is something to keep in mind. What we're dealing with right now, we're in a ceasefire. And of course, Hamas insisted that Israel withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor during this ceasefire. And so we are expected, Israel is expected that if everything continues as planned, that within the eighth day of the second phase of the ceasefire, so that would mean day 50 of the ceasefire, that Israel has to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor, and that by the end of phase two, Israel would have a full withdrawal from Gaza. Now, that's we'll talk more about that as we talk more about what's going on in Israel and the reactions to the ceasefire, because that is an incredibly important point. And because of that, we will discuss whether or not we believe the ceasefire is actually going to hold into phase two. So we'll put a pin in that and we'll hold that for later on when we talk about the reactions. I just want to continue working through the Iranian proxies and the weakening of these Iranian proxies in terms of our fight. So Hamas weakened in terms of military, but still can very much govern and police Gaza. So that's Hamas and Gaza for now. Of course, we have a ceasefire agreement that's been holding. One point on the ceasefire, Hamas has already violated the ceasefire agreement now twice. They violated it first when they didn't release the first names of the hostages that were meant to be released within 24 hours of their release, and or prior to 24 hours to their release. And then of course Israel demanded that the civilians come out first. But what we just had was the release of 4 female hostages. And so they violated the terms by not releasing Arbel Yehud and Shiri Bibas. And then, of course, the Bibas boys, Ariel and baby Kfir. That was a violation of the ceasefire, unless, and this is a very tragic thing to say, but unless they are not alive. If they are deceased, the deal was that live hostages come out first. Now, what we do know is that Islamic Jihad, as of today and yesterday, reported that Arbel Yehud is alive and being held by Islamic Jihad. And the reason she wasn't released was because they classified her as somebody in the military. She's not in the military. She is a civilian. She works for a company that works with the space program in Israel. Nothing to do with the military, but they deemed her military and therefore are trying to get away with this not being a violation of the ceasefire. It was a violation. And Israel, therefore, is now stopping another step that was supposed to take place in the ceasefire, which was on day 7 of the ceasefire, which was yesterday. They were supposed to begin allowing Gazans to return to the northern part of Gaza through the Netzarim corridor, which is the corridor that splits Gaza in half. Israel says we are not going to allow people to return north until Arbel Yehud is released, or at least arrangements for her release are finalized. So that's where we're at right now when it comes to the ceasefire. We should know that it is incredibly, incredibly sensitive, and really many believe that at any moment it can fall apart. So we wait with bated breath. Let's jump away from Gaza and we'll find our way back there at the end. But let's jump to the north to Hezbollah. Key developments that are going on in that conflict. Well, we should know that today is the 60th day of the ceasefire. The ceasefire was brokered on November 27th, began November 27th. The agreement was that in those first 60 days, the Lebanese army would make their way south and would take control of the southern towns along Israel's border and therefore keep Hezbollah out of those towns. That has not happened. And Israel has said that they are not going to withdraw from southern Lebanon until that happens. But what has happened up until November 27th that got Hezbollah to finally agree to a ceasefire? Well, Israel did things that Hezbollah very much didn't expect. Obviously, we had the major pager attack that took place in September. That attack weakened Hezbollah tremendously. It took out a significant amount of the upper echelon of Hezbollah. And then, of course, that was followed very quickly with a strike against the leader of Hezbollah, the man who has been the leader for decades, Hassan Nasrallah. And with that, and then not only Hassan Nasrallah, but every man who was announced to be the successor to Nasrallah was also then assassinated by Israel, resulting in Hezbollah needing to name a leader who is not in Lebanon, but actually sits in Iran, where he could be protected from a potential Israeli assassination. And so Hezbollah, in terms of their personnel, have been significantly weakened. Their upper echelon, their leadership, the heads of the Radwan force have all been eliminated. And therefore, right now, Hezbollah is in a rebuilding phase. And that is why they agreed to a ceasefire, because they needed the break to be able to reconstitute and rebuild. And that is what they're trying to do. So, when it comes to deterrence in terms of Hezbollah, that has very much been restored. And Hezbollah's capabilities to attack Israel in an October 7th like attack have been pretty much eliminated. Israel remained in southern Lebanon and will remain in southern Lebanon until they feel comfortable to withdraw, that the Lebanese army has taken enough control that Hezbollah can no longer threaten the communities along the north of Israel. Communities that, of course, sat evacuated for a year, and still many of them are still evacuated. Many of them won't return home until there's some kind of guarantee. And what we have to understand about that, this is one of the, I think, other tragedies of everything that's happened in the last year and a half, is that many question whether they will ever return to the north. They've resettled in other places. Their kids are going to other schools. And the idea of returning north without a guarantee of safety, given what happened on October 7th, has created a real question mark as to how these communities in the north will continue, and will they go back to what they were in a pre October 7th world, or will they be, unfortunately, left empty as a result of that, still that very real fear and trauma that Israelis are still living with since October 7th. So we wait. But as of right now, Hezbollah is remaining mostly quiet. I should say that today, as of course the 60th day hit, some members of Hezbollah were trying to make their way down into the south. Israel engaged in fire against these individuals, and there have been casualties in Lebanon as we speak this morning, given this fraught ceasefire that is teetering in terms of it being able to be maintained, given that we've reached that 60-day mark, and what was meant to be done, again, i.e., Hezbollah being out and Lebanese army being in, has not happened. So we'll see, but severely weakened. And this is really important. This is really important because if we take a giant step back, we know Hezbollah ultimately was the Iranian insurance policy. They understood that as long as they had Hezbollah on the Israeli border, and that Hezbollah could strike against Israel at any time immediately, as opposed to Iran, who, of course, his response time is significantly longer than the response time that Hezbollah has. Hezbollah can fire and hit us within a minute. Iran, we know, as we saw in the attacks in April and in October and September, that it takes sometimes 10, 15 minutes for their missiles to strike. And so Hezbollah was their insurance policy. And this also affected Iran, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Let's jump to Syria. Syria is an Iranian proxy that has fully fallen. The Assad regime has fallen. They can no longer just use Syria as a base of operation, and this has caused major problems for Iran. The way that they would export goods, specifically arms and individuals from Iran to Lebanon, was through Syria. Now they don't have that access point, making it much more difficult in this moment for them to rearm and for Hezbollah to reconstitute. That's really important, because as much as they wanted that ceasefire to be able to rebuild, then the Syrian regime fell. And now Iran is feeling even more vulnerable. Now, there were two other forces that were also firing at Israel post October 7th, because let's remember the entire Iranian proxy, uh, uh, all of the Iranian proxies turned on post October 7th. So it wasn't just Hezbollah, and it wasn't just, Syria. Actually, Assad said he wanted to stay out of it, and he did. But there were militias in Syria that were firing at Israel. There were also militias in Iraq that were firing at Israel. And then, of course, the Houthis in Yemen. So what we should know is that the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria also stopped firing at Israel. This was 3 days before the ceasefire took effect with Hezbollah. So that was in November 27th, 24th, excuse me, approximately, is when they said, we're going to stop firing at Israel. And we haven't received any missiles from those forces in Iraq or Syria since. And then just recently, in the last 2 weeks, the Houthis have also come out saying that they are going to stop firing. In fact, if I could quote them, they said specifically that the support system in Gaza has come to an end, meaning that their support for Hamas in Gaza has come to an end. There is a ceasefire. And they always said that once there would be a ceasefire in Gaza, as soon as the firing stopped, that they would stop their firing. We should remember, though, that the Houthis have caused tremendous damage in the Bab al Mandab Straits in the Red Sea, as they have continuously been attacking ships. We had a risk of an Exxon Valdez type of oil spill that, thank God, was they managed to repair this ship and prevent that oil spill from happening. But there has been ships after ships that have been attacked by the Houthis. Hopefully, given the circumstances, all of this will now stop. That being said, we shouldn't turn a blind eye to the Houthis. They're there, and it's not just about Israel for them, it's much bigger for them. And this is something that the Americans, the Brits, and others should not take their focus off of. This is a strong and very willing Iranian proxy who is active in those straits, which is one of the most strategic waterways that we have in the world today. Those are the Houthis. Now, let's just zoom in on Iran. Iran, for the first time ever, attacked Israel post October 7th directly. And that happened on April 13th with a massive barrage of drones and interballistic missiles and cruise missiles, around 285 total being launched towards Israel. This was strategically a really poor decision by Iran, because what it did was it exposed Israel's missile defense capabilities in a dramatic fashion, and not just Israel's. But Israel, in the last few years, joined CENTCOM. CENTCOM being Central Command, the United States and their allies, which include the Brits and the French. And they're, of course, they're in communication with the Saudis and the Jordanians. And what we saw on April 13th was a full coalition of CENTCOM and Israel united against this Iranian threat. And so we know that none of those missiles pretty much were able to penetrate, other than some shrapnel, which of course tragically caused serious injuries to a young Bedouin girl in the southern part of Israel. Other than that, there was really almost no damage and no injuries caused, no injuries, period, other than this girl, and really no damage, small damage to a military base, but easily repairable. And what that did was it really showed Iran, you might think that you have the ability to strike Israel, but you kind of don't. And that was a really big deal, because that would make them think twice the next time, because they're trying to show a show of force, which is very important here in the Middle East. And what it really did was it showed how weak they were. Then fast forward to the next strike, right? Right, the day before Rosh Hashanah, they strike us again. I believe it was September 30th this time. And yet again, almost nothing made it through. A few here and there, but no major damage of any kind. And again, this enabled Israel to, one, for show their missile defenses, but also enabled them to strike back against Iran. And this was also very important. The first strike against Iran after the April attack, a lot of people said, what did Israel even do? They barely struck anything. Look, they fired almost 300 projectiles towards Israel, and Israel barely responded. But actually, Israel responded by striking a site in Esfahan. Isfahan is one of the furthest regions of Iran away from Israel, the furthest from Israel. And Israel was able to get through Iranian air defenses and without detection and strike in Esfahan, which sent a message to Iran again, you don't understand our capabilities, but we have great capabilities and we can strike you exactly where you need to be hit. So back off. And of course, they didn't strike again until September. And that was after, let's remember, the horribly embarrassing episode of Israel assassinating the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. And still they didn't respond. And then comes this September 30th strike, which is then again responded to by Israel in a fantastic fashion. Again, a lot of people thought, what did Israel do when they struck in October? It didn't seem like there was any massive strike of any kind. No, Israel very strategically in October struck all of Iranian missile defense systems. And essentially, post October, we left Iran bare of military of aerial defenses. They do not have a missile defense system. We destroyed their missile defense system. As one commentator said, he quoted it by saying, the Ayatollah has no clothes. They are open to attack right now. And here's the important thing about what's going on globally. Iran got its missile defense system from Russia. And Russia, of course, has no missile defense systems right now that they are able to spare. And so we also know that it will take a significant amount of time for Iran to rebuild those military defenses, those missile defenses, those aerial defenses. So if Israel would like to strike Iran and strike its nuclear facilities, strike its oil facilities, right now Iran has very little capabilities of defending against those strikes. And that is probably one of the many reasons that things have gone somewhat quiet. Iran is weak. They are weak internally. Their their own citizens are very much against the regime, and their proxies have been weakened dramatically since all of this started. So when it comes to our capabilities and where we are at in terms of Iran, deterrence has been completely restored, and they are at the point of pulling back, and they will most likely go into a phase of what in Islamic terms is called a hudna, a ceasefire for the sake of rebuilding, reconstituting, and then once we're ready to strike back. Many believe that given the new Trump administration and where the Israelis are at, that soon enough, Israel at the right time will plan a serious strike against Iran. As we believe, many analysts believe that given the rise of the Trump administration, that the Iranians are rushing towards a bomb right now. They are rushing towards nuclear breakout to eventually try to develop not just the nuclear capabilities, but also the warhead and then the delivery capabilities to deliver a nuclear weapon. And that is why all eyes are on Iran right now when it comes to the Israeli military echelon in terms of when would be the opportune time to strike Iran given the reduction of their defenses. So that's where we're at with our proxies. I want to talk about one more area that is probably one of the focal points right now in Israel, and that's of course the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. This is a place where many fear that at any moment things can really explode. We also know that some Palestinian prisoners are being released into the West Bank, not the violent prisoners, but still organizers are being released into the West Bank. And that is a growing fear as well. And what we are also seeing is post October 7th, there's been almost an emboldening that has happened within the West Bank. And Hamas has gained tremendous support in the West Bank, as opposed to in Gaza, where they are severely losing support. So the West Bank is a flashpoint right now. We know there have been a couple of terror attacks in the West Bank over the last few weeks. We also know Israel is conducting a very large operation in the city of Jenin to weed out more of these terrorists. What is an interesting fact that has emerged from this from what's going on in the West Bank is that the Palestinian Authority has actually been aiding Israel in their counterterrorism operation in Jenin. That is a new development. But again, that's really the PA trying to demonstrate to not just to Israel, but to the world and specifically to the Americans that they're trying to present themselves as a responsible party that should be the one to take over in a post-Hamas world. And so that's the West Bank. I should also mention that on top of the Palestinian terrorism that has been inflamed in the West Bank, we are also seeing growing fringe radical settler violence that's taking place as well. I mean, just last week, we had multiple villages being infiltrated and homes being set on fire, cars being set on fire, storefronts being vandalized, and physical harm being caused to Palestinians from these. Again, I want to make it very clear, fringe radical settlers. I'm not talking about the wider Israeli population that lives in Judea and Samaria. I'm talking about a very small minority of radical, fringe, violent settlers, again, Israelis who live over the Green Line, who have been going into these villages and really inflaming, unfortunately, more tension within a tinderbox that many are trying to keep from igniting. Now, with everything that's happened, what what's been the impact on Israelis and on Palestinians? Where are we at in terms of Palestinians' approach to the future and Israelis? I want to start with the Palestinians and we'll move into the Israelis. So, first of all, you have very, very different responses from Palestinians in Gaza versus Palestinians in the West Bank, which of course is to be expected. Gazans have suffered tremendously over the last year and a half. There's no doubt about that. From the many displaced, we know that over 90% of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been displaced since this war. makes sense given that we evacuated all of northern Gaza, which was over half the population, and then continued to evacuate much of the south as well, Rafah, Khan Yunis, etc. So they have dealt with, first of all, homelessness. They have dealt with a lack of aid that oftentimes doesn't reach them. And I'm going to actually quote a poll in terms of why they believe the aid isn't reaching them, which is actually really interesting given what the international community is saying versus what actual Gazans themselves are saying. But of course, Gazans have been way more directly impacted and therefore have a very different view on Hamas than the people in the West Bank, who, of course, a year ago in November were able to greet all of the prisoners who were released in the first hostage release. And now they were also able to greet even more prisoners who were released. And so, in the eyes of the West Bank Palestinians, Hamas's popularity has grown tremendously, whereas in Gaza it has shrunk significantly. So the most recent poll was taken November, December. It was taken right as the ceasefire with Hezbollah was being enacted, and it took place over the span of about 6 days in the West Bank and in Gaza, in-person interviews. And what we got from that poll was that in Gaza, only 5% of Gazans want Hamas to continue to rule after the ceasefire. 30 and instead of Hamas, about 31% support a Palestinian Authority-led government. So that's a huge shift. And you might also be thinking, but wait, that's only 46% of the population. What about the rest? The rest are contemplating Arab governance in Gaza or an international governance of some kind in Gaza. So there's a lot of different ideas, but 5%, the lowest, support continued Hamas rule, and the highest in terms of a plurality support a Palestinian Authority-led government in Gaza. So that's obviously a huge shift from what we saw a year ago, for example, when Hamas was still very actively engaged in fighting against Israel and was showing a sign of tremendous force, which is one of the ways that you get legitimacy within Palestinian society. A way to get legitimacy and for you to govern is through resistance against Israel. And so that is why we saw that. But as things deteriorate in Gaza, we have seen less and less of that. And some believe that once Gazans are able to return to northern Gaza, that again Hamas's popularity might drop even more, given the amount of destruction that waits for them in northern Gaza. So that's in terms of governance. If you jump to the West Bank, it's wildly different. As opposed to 5% who support Hamas taking over in Gaza, in the West Bank, 25%. So 1 in 4 people in the West Bank want Hamas to rule in the West Bank. 10% want the Palestinian Authority. Now, this also makes sense. If you ask the people in the West Bank, where is this coming from, and why Hamas rather than the Palestinian Authority, they will almost always bring up Palestinian Authority corruption, and more importantly, they'll also bring up that they believe that the Palestinian Authority has been collaborating with Israel, and that's again the worst thing you could do in terms of being able to gain popularity amongst the Palestinians. So that is why those numbers are so different. And then when asked about whether or not they believe that things are heading in the wrong direction, that was what came from the question, the wrong direction. Actually, what's interesting is that in Gaza, the number dropped from 84% who believed they were going in the wrong direction. That was back in October, to now only 60% believe that we're going in the wrong direction. Whereas in the West Bank, it rose from 59% in October to now 79% in December. And they say that it's due to a deteriorating political, security, and economic prospects. And that again immediately denotes what is going on in the West Bank. There is a deteriorating political situation, and the PA has more and more lost control over the West Bank. And some of us joke, we call it the wild, wild West Bank, because there's a significant amount of lawlessness going on in the West Bank in certain cities that the PA just does not have solid control over. And then security prospects. There are constant Israeli counterterrorism operations. And we, of course, as Israelis, as Zionists, see them as counterterrorism operations. Palestinians see them as raids against their communities. And they would say that that is a deteriorating security situation. And then economic prospects. Obviously, with growing violence, the economic situation gets worse and worse, which has also been aided by the fact that post October 7th, we had, well, pre October 7th, I should say, there was approximately somewhere around 120 to 180,000 Palestinians who were getting permits to work inside of to work inside of Israel. Upon October 7th happening, we cut those permits. We put a temporary hold and we said until things change, we're going to stop people from the West Bank to be able to work inside of Israel. That has obviously aided in the economic instability in the West Bank, as many of those people obviously made a tremendous salary in Israel, about 4 times the salary that they would have made inside of the West Bank. So, of course, that is contributing as well to the economic hardship that we're seeing in the West Bank. And if anyone's sitting there saying that I'm justifying it or I'm trying to say that that's a bad thing, I'm not. I'm just presenting the information. Obviously, Israel had every reason to prevent these people from coming into Israel post October 7th, given that we were very unaware of who would be loyal and who would not be loyal. And as we have seen, terrorist attacks have been taking place inside of Israel, sometimes by individuals who do have permits to work inside of southern Israel. Excuse me, inside of Israel, period. So that makes a lot of sense in terms of, again, how West Bank Palestinians are feeling versus how Gazans are feeling. And when polled about future elections, first of all, there's overwhelming support for elections, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, more in Gaza than in the West Bank, but they're both above 80%. In Gaza, it's above 90%. And when polled who you would vote for, actually, Khalid Mashal, who is now the de facto leader of Hamas after all of the others were killed, he still comes in the lowest if you compare him to people like Marwan Barghouti, who was the head of the Palestinian Authorities, the head of Fatah's Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which was their military wing, or what some would call their terror wing. He would still beat out Khalid Mashal, and Mahmoud Abbas would beat out Khalid Mashal. So we're seeing that even if elections were to happen, that we wouldn't get Hamas victory, but no political entity would get a majority. So there would have to be coalition building within the Palestinian parliament to achieve a majority, a coalition within their parliament. Last thing I want to talk about in terms of the Palestinians. Obviously, sentiment towards Israel is at an all-time low. And by the way, this is across the board. There was a poll done in the summer that was very telling in terms of how Israelis and how Palestinians have reacted to October 7th and the aftermath. And trust is at an all-time low. And the tragedy is really perception is also at an all-time low, meaning that what we saw was in both polls, over 90% of both Palestinians and Israelis believe that the other side wants to destroy them, wants them to no longer exist. And as long as that's the sentiment, it's almost impossible to move forward with these two populations. There is a lot of healing, a lot of trauma that needs to be healed on both sides right now if we're ever going to move forward. That is what the sentiment that we're hearing from both sides is showing us. Now, one last thing, I mentioned the humanitarian aid and how people really reacted in Gaza, of course, differently because they have been in serious food insecurity, have really struggled to be able to find basic needs. And that's a question of who's responsible. And now in the international community and in international media, we almost always are hearing that the culprit, the individual, the entity to blame for a lack of humanitarian aid is Israel. Now, what's interesting is when polled in Gaza, the largest share of respondents, which was actually 39%, attributed issues in aid distribution to the actions of local community leaders and merchants. So, not to Israel. So, close to 40% believe that the reason that they're struggling to get aid is not Israel, it's local merchants and leaders, meaning Hamas and others. And then, of course, merchants who would buy aid from Hamas that had been stolen by Hamas and then sell it in the market at exorbitant prices. And so you have had individuals within Gaza who have been profiting off of the lack of aid and have been taking advantage of this and really charging, again, exorbitant prices for people to be able to just get access to basic things like flour. So then 39% say it's local merchants and leaders. 31% say though that the problem is compounded by movement restrictions imposed by Israel, leading to shortages and an uneven distribution of the assistance. But then again, and now this is even more interesting, 21% of respondents blame local NGOs and other distribution organizations like UNRWA. And then 7% hold that international humanitarian aid organizations are responsible. So, what's interesting is that when you put that all together, the majority, over 50%, do not blame Israel for a lack of aid. They actually blame the local, again, merchants, leaders, NGOs, and others. And I mean, to me, as somebody who's looking and trying to analyze what could the future be, that is a positive, that they see that it's not Israel trying to prevent them from getting aid, that it's not Israel trying to starve them, is one of the accusations that's been thrown around the world, but actually it's internal issues that are causing more of a problem. If only the international media would report on numbers like this, we would have a much more honest picture of what's going on in Gaza and better understand why Gazans feel the way that they do towards Hamas at this point. So that's the Palestinians. All right, let's wrap this up by talking about where Israel's at. And I want to preface this by saying that it's not going to be the greatest of news. So let's dive in. I wish I could say that Israel was this united country that we were post October 7th. And we've gone through a wave, right? Post October 7th, every sign in Israel said one thing very clearly: Beyachad nenatzeach. Together, united, we will be victorious. United, we will succeed. Beyachad nenatzeach. And we were united for a little while. We were. The country came together to support to the hostages, to support the soldiers, to support the evacuees from the north and the south. And there was a tremendous amount of unity within the country. It lasted about 6 months. And then things started to become more and more divided again. And Israel today remains a very, very divided country. Even within the hostage families themselves, there is a division. You have the hostage family forum demanding a deal of any kind, demanding that this deal complete its way all the way through phase 3 so that we can get every single hostage back, both alive and those who are deceased. But then you have the Tikva forum, another hostage group that says, no, absolutely not. My child would not want a terrorist released from jail for their return. And so you have this division, even within the hostage families. One side who says a deal at almost all costs, and others who say absolutely not, no deal. And that really goes to, well, what is the goal, right? What are people fighting for? And this was from the get go, starting from October 7th onwards. We talked about what were the goals of this war. And you had two core goals: one, the elimination of Hamas, and two, the return of all the hostages. Now, there was a third added later on relating to Hezbollah, relating to enabling the evacuees from the north to return home. But let's focus on those two: return of the hostages, total victory against Hamas. And many started to understand that these two things could be contradictory, that for us to get the hostages home, we might have to stop fighting against Hamas. And that's, of course, what we are seeing play out as we speak. And so Israelis are still very divided. There is a small portion of Israelis, about under 25%, who say we should not be negotiating. We should not be releasing these terrorists. We should not be doing this for the sake of the hostages. We have to just keep fighting in Gaza. Now, the vast majority of Israelis, not vast majority, excuse me, 55% of Israelis today believe that we should have a ceasefire to bring back all of the hostages, even if that means an end to the war. But that's right now. And we'll see as these releases continue, as the prisoner releases continue, we will see if that holds at 55% or drops below a majority once we start to see, tragically, the deceased being returned, where we're releasing terrorists not for live hostages, but for bodies. So again, a lot of division and a lot of people who have also shifted their positions from total victory maybe a year ago to now it's been too long. We have to get the hostages home. They have a ticking time. They could be dying in captivity versus this war, which we can continue after the fact if necessary to get rid of Hamas. And so that's the overwhelming debate that's going on in Israel right now. But as of right now, 55% again support this deal and want to see this deal continue. There's an ongoing debate that's happening in Israel that's going to continue to fester. And that is, of course, about army service. Many soldiers have been killed over close. We're slowly ticking up, unfortunately, to close to 500 soldiers who have been killed. By the way, much less than what anyone thought would be the death toll in a full out war with Hamas, but still a tremendous high toll. And who's paying that toll? Predominantly are members of the religious Zionist community and members of the secular community. The ultra-Orthodox community, of course, still is refusing to serve in the army, and this has become a ongoing and very serious debate because even within the coalition, let's remember that in the coalition you have Likud, which is predominantly, again, more secular, traditional Zionists, a lot of them Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East, who almost entirely, exclusively serve in the army. Then you have the religious Zionist camp of Bezalel Smotrich, again, almost exclusively very much serve in the army. They're religious Zionists. Zionist is the key. They do serve in the army. And then you have the ultra Orthodox who do not serve in the army. And they're all part of the same coalition. And so there's been tension within the coalition because Bezalel Smotrich is saying, my people, the religious Zionists, are paying a huge toll. There is a huge burden on my community that this other community is not bearing at all. And meanwhile, while that's happening, that community is trying to get legislation passed in Israel that would create a permanent exemption for the ultra Orthodox in the army. So, this is another issue that is causing tremendous tension within Israel and even again within the coalition itself, where we expect tension between the opposition and the coalition in terms of how to conduct the war, in terms of how to move forward. But within the coalition, we're seeing this faltering as a result. Now, the other thing to note is that the coalition just got a little smaller. This ceasefire deal led to one of the furthest, not one of, the furthest right wing party in Israel, the Otzma Yehudit or Jewish Power Party of Itamar Ben Gvir, to leave the government, to leave the coalition. That also means that he will let go of his position as uh, Minister of Internal Security, essentially his role in overseeing the police. Now, this was possible. He was able to withdraw from the government without the coalition collapsing because Gidon Sar, a man who leads another party who wasn't part of the coalition, joined the coalition a few months ago, which gave Bibi more seats in his coalition, enabling Itamar Ben Gvir to leave the government without the government collapsing. Now, we're in phase one of the ceasefire deal. It's supposed to last 42 days. Bibi is speaking out of the both sides of his mouth. To the Trump administration, he's saying the deal is going to hold. And the Trump administration is pretty much putting their foot down, saying, we want this deal to hold. Meanwhile, to his coalition partner, Bezalel Smotrich, he is saying, don't worry, we're not going to get to phase two. We will not go through with a full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Phase two, again, will be in 42 days. If phase two goes into effect, Bezalel Smotrich has said that he will also withdraw from the government. If that happens, the Bibi coalition will fall and Israel will go into an election cycle. Again, like I said, this ceasefire deal has a lot of implications for a lot of different people. For the government in Israel, for of course Israel's security, as we are releasing many murderers in this deal, and of course, the major implication, though, being for the hostage families that we are watching live hostages being returned home after close to 450 days, actually 475 days in captivity. And so, again, I'm sure you can hear the dilemmas, and I'm sure even inside of every single one of us, those dilemmas are pushing and pulling us because there's so much to think about. The future of Israel with with terrorists being released who can reconstitute and then attack Israel again, but of course getting our hostages home, but then doesn't that encourage more hostage taking in the future? There's a lot here. And then lastly, the big question. If you go all the way through to phase 3 of the ceasefire deal, that means a permanent end to the war. And that means, how do we get rid of Hamas? And for most Israelis, they want to see Hamas gone in Gaza, at least no military capabilities and no policing and governing capabilities. And how those two things How can we make them compatible? Because right now they're not. Now, there's a few more last things that I want to just mention. One, in terms of Israeli leadership, we have to understand that October 7th didn't really change much at all. In terms of the leadership of the government, nothing has really changed other than, again, the resignation of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Gideon Sa'ar joining the coalition. But we haven't had any resignations from the government of any kind other than Yoav Gallant, who, of course, was defense minister on October 7th and remained defense minister until just a couple of months ago, when then he resigned his post. Other than that, we've had no resignations from the government. However, we've had serious intelligence and IDF resignations. The head of intelligence, just now the chief of staff of the IDF, issued his resignation. And across the board of the IDF and the intelligence community, we have had full responsibility being taken for October 7th. Tragically, from the government, we haven't seen that at all. No responsibility has really been taken by anyone in the government. And there's been no resignations. And then most recently, what we've had is the IDF a year ago launched an internal investigation for what happened on October 7th. So the IDF has been internally investigating themselves, which obviously has a tremendous value. But there has been an ongoing push for an independent inquiry into what happened on October 7th. That has still not happened. Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff, when he was resigning last week, he very much said that was one of the last things he said was he pushed for an independent inquiry to be launched to investigate what happened on October 7th and the failures of October 7th. The government last week passed legislation stating that they are not going to support a independent inquiry into October 7th. And unfortunately, there is a lot of pushback from Israelis who very much believe that the reason that the government doesn't want to pursue an independent inquiry into October 7th is to avoid them being blamed for what happened on October 7th and the failures of not just the IDF and the intelligence, but of the government itself in terms of their actions leading up to October 7th. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, and it's a painful thing to talk about, but I think it needs to be said. And I think if you haven't been in Israel in the last year, you probably are unaware that this is happening. But in terms of just the Israeli sentiment, I grew up in Israel. I've just spent the last 12 years of my life living in Israel. And something that I always felt from Israelis was tremendous compassion and empathy, not from everybody, but from a lot of Israelis, and specifically a lot of those people who, of course, lived in those southern communities who felt a tremendous drive to want to try to solve the conflict. They were peaceniks ultimately, and they looked at the Palestinians as their neighbors and some of them even as their friends. Well, since October 7th, and I don't in any way blame Israelis for this, and let me preface this by saying that, but many Israelis have become very radicalized in the sense that they can't feel any kind of compassion for the Palestinians, no empathy. And you know, I talk a lot about the difference between a victimhood mentality and a survivor mentality. And as Jews, I think we have throughout our history very much embraced a survivor mentality, a mentality of we're going to pick up, we're going to keep going, we're not going to look back, we're going to look forward, we're going to take accountability when we need to take accountability for what we've done, we're going to keep having self reflection, and we're going to keep growing and we're going to keep getting better versus the victimhood mentality that unfortunately the Palestinians really has been ingrained into the Palestinians over the last 80 years of you're the victim, you have nothing, you have no agency, you have no responsibility and therefore no accountability for anything that you do, right? You are the victim and you're owed something and you're entitled to something. And again, nothing you do is your fault and everything you do is excusable because of what you've lived through. Tragically, I feel, and I think many Israelis have started to feel that Israelis have taken on a mentality of victimhood where they look at Gaza and they say, we can do no wrong. And it doesn't really matter if a soldier has broken the rules or if a war crime has been committed, it is what it is. Look at what they did to us on October 7th. And as an Israeli, as a Jewish person, I get the sentiment. What they did to us on October 7th was beyond brutal, beyond it's hard to even comprehend the depths of the barbarism and the brutality of that day. But I think it's so not us to turn into that victim and start to adopt a mentality that we can do no wrong. And that somehow, because of what they did to us, anything we do to them is justified. The war, sure, not even a question. And if you ask any Israeli, not even a question. But the specific actions taken during the war, I think those still need to be investigated. And Israelis, unfortunately, that sentiment's not there. I hope I'm mentioning it because I think that awareness needs to be brought to it. It's not a judgment. It's not saying that it's not so understandable and so warranted given what happened. But I guess I am hoping that we continue to get better, that we heal from that trauma, and we figure out a way to move forward in a positive way and use October 7th and everything we've managed to do in terms of the threats against Israel, use this all as a catalyst for good moving forward. That's what I hope for. I hope that more of our hostages come home safe and sound. And I hope that we can find a way to get our hostages back and then also eliminate the threat of Hamas along our border so that people will never have to fear again that October 7th could repeat itself in Israeli territory. So let's pray for our hostages. Let's keep hoping that the IDF and Israel can continue to build up that deterrence and defend Israelis in Israel and around the world. And I wasn't asked to speak about anti-Semitism in the world today, and that's why I did not touch on that as what has changed since October 7th. But maybe that could be a follow-up at some point in the future. But I hope that that was helpful and comprehensive and gave y'all a much better understanding of where we are today. I have to say, with everything that I said, I am still incredibly hopeful. I really do think that October 7th can be the catalyst for the future and a catalyst for good moving forward. And I hope that we just continue to build in that direction and maintain that hope across the board. So thank you all so much. And I'm happy to now take the many questions that I see have been coming through in the last hour.
Yes. So I'm combining a bunch of them, Charlotte. So if anybody has more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. There are lots of them in there. I'm going to combine things that are sort of related. There's one about a topic that you haven't touched on, so I'm going to start there, and then we're going to go to all the things that people want to understand more deeply about things you already have touched on. So the topic has to do with the Abraham Accords, and questions include what's been the effect of 10/7 on the Abraham Accords? Have the Abraham Accords assisted the ceasefire? Will Saudi Arabia join the Abraham Accords? What will be the consequences if they do? And who deserves the credit? All of those.
All right. Well, first of all, the Abraham Accords actually, it was a very good sign that post October 7th, the Abraham Accords didn't fall apart. These countries did not pull away from Israel. In fact, there was conferences in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia during the last year and a half where there was demands by the Iranians and others for there to be complete cutoff of Israel, that all relations should be cut off. And the Abraham Accord countries said, no, we are going to keep working with Israel. In fact, one of the only airlines, I think it might have been the only airline that was flying in and out of Israel post October 7th, other than El Al and Israeli Airlines, was Air Dubai or Fly Dubai and the Emirates. They were the only. And so many Israelis actually found their way out of Israel through Dubai or through Abu Dhabi. So the Abraham Accords have actually held really solidly. Now, there has been talk from those countries going back and forth because their people are very, very upset with what they're seeing coming out of Gaza. So they're trying to maintain the relationship with Israel diplomatically and on a government level, while also trying to make sure that their people don't get so outraged that there is that continuing relationship. And so the rhetoric has been very anti-Hamas, not necessarily anti-Israel, and they've been able to kind of maintain that relationship with Israel through it. It's obviously not as strong as it was pre-October 7th, but it's still very much alive and well. The Saudis, many believe that they will join the Abraham Accords once the time is right and the conditions are right. And most believe that in the 4-year term of Donald Trump, that the Saudis will most likely normalize relations with Israel again when they see that the time is most opportune. Who should take credit? I hate this question. I'm sorry. No offense to anyone who asked it. Who cares? Look, obviously the Trump administration, they were the ones who did it, right? You had also a lot of interaction happening well prior to the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, between Arabs and Israelis in places like the UAE and in Bahrain that was kind of gearing us up to that. There was the GCC. And so who should take credit? The people on the ground who are willing to reach out their hand and actually do this. And yes, of course, people in the Trump administration who were able to get it through, and then people in the Biden administration who helped maintain it during this very fraught time in the last year and a half. And let's just hope that the now Trump administration can take it even to higher heights. But it's definitely a positive, and let's understand that the main reason that it held was also because what October 7th demonstrated was, again, the very severe growing Iranian threat that doesn't just threaten Israel, but also threatens the Arab Sunni world. And so at that moment, it wouldn't have made sense for them to abandon Israel because their own enemy, Iran, was growing in strength. And they were watching as Israel was eliminating that strength slowly but surely. And they obviously stood by and watched and obviously understand that that is going to impact them positively. So the Abraham Accords have held, and let's just hope that they keep growing now that there's a ceasefire and things are hopefully going to calm down a little bit. And maybe, just maybe, those countries can also come in and help with this reconstruction plan for Gaza that's supposed to be laid out in phase 3 of the ceasefire deal.
So thanks. You said that Hamas recruits are poorly trained, um, but do they have sufficient numbers and arms to retain effective control of Gaza? And how does one square Hamas's lessened popularity, which you talked about in the poll, lessened popularity in Gaza with their ability to recruit?
So it all depends. I mean, again, we said 5% want them to continue to govern, but also who are we polling, right? That's a big piece. The response coming out of the Americans and others who said that they've been able to recruit has been mostly young men. The rest of the population is very anti. And so that's just a small portion of the population that is being recruited to basically act as police. I would almost think about it like a gang, that a gang is in a place and they have control, and that's how they recruit young men to say, we'll give you power of some sort. Do they have enough men and arms to fully reconstitute? No, but they are still the strongest power in Gaza. So they're not, it's not that they have so much power that they're going to fully be able to take full control, but there's nobody stronger than them to do it either. And nobody right now who wants to. Islamic Jihad is powerful, but they've never wanted governing capabilities, and they don't want governing capabilities. For them, they understand that it's more of a headache than anything else. And so the reason why Hamas is able to now reconstitute to a certain extent their policing and governing capabilities is just because there's nobody stronger than them to be able to take them down. And that's really the next step. The conversation moving forward is who could potentially take over and be strong enough to then fully get rid of Hamas in terms of their, again, governing and policing capabilities. So that's what we're trying to figure out over the next few months.
So that leads into another question, which is a big one. I mean, the question is wrapped around two-state solution. You said there's a lack of trust in general, and it's going to take time to heal. Do you see any hope for an eventual two-state solution? And if so, what has to change for that to become a reality? And then tying it to what you just said, for a two-state solution, obviously you need a trusted partner. Who might that leader be on the Palestinian side?
Yeah, so to answer the last question first, I don't think we know who that leader is yet, but there are options. And I think sometimes, given the Palestinian Authority corruption and support for terror, and then Hamas just being terrorists themselves, it really makes us think like those are the only two options. There is a Fatah shadow government that is remarkably moderate. And if anyone, I would love to share a podcast. There was a podcast, if you want to look it up, it was in like May of last year on the Israel Policy Forum. But there is a Palestinian, oh, his name is Sinan Jawli, and Saeed Simich. This man talks like moderate Israelis talk in terms about the future. And it's one of the more, whenever I hear him speak, I always get a dose of hope. And I'm going to Barbara, I'll try to get the name for you and send it to you, because for me, I think everyone should listen to this to give them a little bit of hope. But there are other options. We just have to, the challenge is that they don't feel strong enough to be able to take over. And so with changing realities, Mahmoud Abbas could pass away soon. He is very old. Here's the broader answer to this question. There's no solution to this conflict right now. That's the answer right now. There's no solution to this conflict right now because there is zero trust between the two parties. There is nobody on the Palestinian side right now who's willing to step up and make the necessary sacrifices and challenges and put himself in a position where he could be targeted by more radical Palestinians right now to be able to move forward with any kind of solution, be it a two-state solution or some other formula that is created, creative formula that's created for this specific circumstance. But it's the same answer. You know, it's a two-state solution to Israelis right now, and they're going to roll their eyes at you and say you're crazy. But if you say the two-state solution in principle, right? What, we finally can re-educate and move forward, and maybe in 2 generations, they're like, well, yeah, of course I'd be for a two-state solution in those circumstances. So we have to understand is sometimes we talk about the two-state solution in reality versus the two-state solution in principle. And many are still in that place of in principle, yeah, of course, like that makes the most sense. But more and more Israelis have now shifted to we can't trust the Palestinians to have a state alongside us. And that's probably going to take 2 generations to rebuild. And so does it mean that we should stop talking about it altogether? I don't know. If you believe that that's the right solution, if you believe that both Jews and Palestinians have the right to self-determination in that land, then you shouldn't let go of the belief in principle. The question then is, what do we need to do to build towards it, right? And that's what I would say to anybody listening who has an idea of solutions, right? To think, okay, well, this is what I think might be the best formula, the best solution moving forward. Okay, well, then what now needs to happen on the ground to make that a reality? Right. So if you're a two-state solutioner, okay, well, we just hit on the head the first thing, right? We need to have trust, right? We need to fully rebuild trust. And that's a generation in the making, right? That's not something that's just going to happen, especially not after the type of attack that we suffered on October 7th. So there's first a rehabilitation that needs to happen because of the intense trauma that now both sides have gone through. And then there's going to have to be the rebuilding of trust. And then there's going to have to be this conversation about how we can move forward. We're talking about maybe 30 years of work that would need to be done to even get to a point where we can start to talk about a solution. And to me, my theory, my Charlotte, take that for what you will, is it's all going to come down to education. And that's why I started an education organization. And I firmly believe in education. And probably, again, one of the things that's been most jarring for me in the last year was teaching Israelis and hearing the the radicalization. It's not like they were taught it. It's not like the Palestinians who are taught to hate Jews and taught to hate Israelis in their textbooks and in their schools. But the post October 7th reality in Israel is one with there is a lot of hate towards the Palestinians. There is very little compassion towards the Palestinians. And that is from people who prior were peaceniks. And so there is so much work that needs to be done on the healing side and then on the education side. And the education side is just learning about each other. And it's not learning about Hamas or trying to justify Hamas, but it's understanding each other's narratives, understanding each other's connections to that land. Why are we both still there? Why are we both so insistent on being there, given what both of us have now suffered in this territory? And that goes deep to our stories. And those are stories that we're not exposed to anymore. And so there's a lot of rebuilding that's going to need to be done. And a message out to world leaders is really stop recognizing a Palestinian state. Stop talking about needing to establish a two-state solution today or tomorrow or in a year from now, because it is a delusion right now. And really all it would probably lead to if you forced that would be more war and more violence and really no end to the conflict. It would just be a new conflict that would emerge just under different circumstances. So I do have hope, but my hope rests on a tremendous amount of action that I will take over the rest of my life and that I hope other people will join me in taking. And that's where my hope comes from. It comes from really day-to-day action that'll get us there.
So going from the large to the specific for a moment, the question is how has Israel destroyed the Gaza tunnels, and is that part of the reason that the buildings are destroyed in Gaza?
So, northern Gaza is about 90% gone in terms of infrastructure. There are very, very few buildings still standing in northern Gaza. Same in Rafah, and a lot in Khan Yunis. So, and all of the reason for that is, like was in the question, all of the tunnel networks that were underneath, and then just other terror infrastructure that was built into these buildings. And so, I mean, our soldiers were reporting that around, again, 90% of buildings in Gaza were being used for some type of terror activity or had tunnel shafts in and out of them. And so that's why there was the need for all of that, unfortunately, all of that destruction. The only way to destroy a tunnel, you'll ultimately end up destroying the infrastructure up above. That being said, we can't say all because there were parts of Gaza that we never went into. The area, if you can imagine the Gaza Strip, the Nuseirat, the Netzarim corridor runs right in the middle of Gaza, right? Well, right south of that, along the coast, is the area of Nuseirat, and that was an area that Israel basically never really went into fully. We went in for some small operations, specifically the operation that rescued Noah Argamani and the other 3 hostages. At that time, that was done there, but pretty much we stayed out of that area. And that's where a lot of Hamas went. And that is where we know that the remaining battalion of Hamas that Hamas kept out of the fighting was. So we know that there are still terror tunnels in those areas, the areas that we never went into. But in terms of northern Gaza and southern Gaza, pretty much from what we know, all the tunnels that we found have been destroyed. So not the entire network, but much of it. And that's also, again, why, again, so much infrastructure was destroyed above ground. Yes.
Could you please comment on the role of Egypt in resupplying Hamas versus being pressured to accept Gazan refugees, preventing smuggling by the Rafah tunnels?
So, based on intelligence that we have and what I've heard from Israeli officials, there is no knowledge that we have that the president of Egypt, that Sisi, knew that there was smuggling going on underneath the Rafah border. And Israel wasn't aware either. This was a major intelligence gap that actually many people argue is one of the reasons that October 7th was able to happen, because Israel, being unaware of Hamas's capabilities to arm in the way that they armed themselves, kept us thinking that even if Hamas had attacked us, that they wouldn't have had enough military capabilities and enough ammunition to be able to actually cause as much harm as they did. So we are convinced, Israeli officials are convinced that what happened in Rafah was a few Egyptian commanders were bribed essentially to allow smuggling to take place underneath the Egyptian border. Now, since that time, Israel has fully retaken control of the Philadelphia corridor and the Rafah crossing, and has destroyed all of the tunnels underneath. So the question of Egypt's role, well, now there'll be serious monitoring. I mean, the trust, unfortunately, between Israel and Egypt has been broken, and that needs to be rebuilt for sure. Sisi is very much on the Israeli side. Sisi hates the Muslim Brotherhood and therefore hates Hamas, and in no way would have been on board with resupplying Hamas in Gaza, also because of the blowback. We now see that there is a demand for Egypt to take in refugees, which is the last thing that Egypt wants to do. So Egypt really wants to maintain this positive relationship with Israel and regain that trust from Israel, but also be able to be a mediator of some kind. The last thing they want to do is take in refugees. I will say about the comments about the refugees to people in this audience, especially, we need to be very careful about this conversation. Palestinians, when we talk about, and specifically I'm commenting on it because the headlines today coming out of the Trump administration is that Trump made comments about speaking to Jordan and Egypt about taking in Palestinians. We have to remember what the Palestinian response is to this, which is in 1948, Arab leaders also told us to leave and said that we would be able to come back, and then we were never able to come back. And so the response often is, you're just trying to ethnically cleanse us from Gaza. And the last thing we want is more of those accusations being thrown at us. And so we need to be very sensitive about this conversation about people leaving the Gaza Strip. If it's a temporary leave to rebuild, the question also is that necessary? People have been evacuated from the north for over a year now. We could easily rebuild the north while they're still in southern Gaza and then repeat the process in the south. I mean, not easily, it would be a process, but it's not, you don't need to remove the civilians for that to happen. So what's Egypt's responsibility? They're not required to take in refugees at this point. There's a ceasefire. People don't have to flee Gaza to protect their lives. And so really it's a matter of how much should Egypt play a role right now in the rebuilding. There is one piece to this that's important, that's part of the ceasefire deal, which is that Egypt did agree that wounded Gazans, both fighters and civilians, if they're severely wounded, could be transferred out of the Gaza Strip through the Rafah crossing to either Egypt or other countries where those people would get medical aid, medical assistance. So that is part of the responsibilities that they have taken on, that they've committed to. But I do not see Egypt or Jordan in the near future or ever, to be honest with you, agreeing to take in anybody from Gaza, or especially not mass numbers of people from Gaza. Maybe reuniting families here and there, but the idea that they would take in mass refugees, slim to none. If they haven't taken them until now, they're not taking them now. So Egypt is there's a mea culpa that should be done here in terms of their ignorance or turning a blind eye to the smuggling under the border, and making sure that that can never happen again, and that they're monitoring it much closely moving forward, which I think they'll do based on our relationship with Egypt and where Sisi sits ideologically.
There are a number of questions about nuclear capacity of Iran, which I don't know is an area of your expertise, but I'm going to give you the question anyway, and if you have an opinion, that would be great. One is, can we expect an attack on Iran nuclear facilities, particularly those that require a MOAB to penetrate underground facilities? And then another question around this is, what, if anything, do you see as a possibility for preventing the nuclear capability in Iran? Do you potentially see Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE working together to prevent this capacity from developing?
All possible. So, I mean, we've heard now for the last like 6 months that Iran is within 2 weeks to 3 weeks of nuclear breakout, which means essentially what our analysts are saying is that they could have already achieved nuclear breakout. The thing is that that doesn't mean that they have a delivery system and ways to get it. But as of right now, we don't think they've achieved nuclear breakout. Uh, could they quickly? Yes. And that's the fear. Will there be a strike? Look, what Israel did in October set us up to be able to strike Iran when we deem it necessary. Now that the Trump administration is in office, I think that's really going to be the X factor. I think Israel understands very clearly that the only way we are going to stop Iran from nuclear breakout is a military strike. It's not going to happen through sanctions. It's not going to happen in any other way other than a military strike. Now, Israel has been preparing for that type of strike for many, many years. Now they have more support than they've ever had before. But it really all comes down to the Trump administration. We've heard different rhetoric from Trump. In his first term, it was maximum pressure on Iran, sanctions, and a very aggressive approach. Now what we've heard coming in is we want to end wars, we want to stop wars, we want to start more wars. And so obviously a strike against Iran is a very serious military strike that you imagine, given that rhetoric, that the Trump administration might not want, but also we don't know. They could very much shift their policy as they inch closer to nuclear breakout. In terms of capabilities, Israel believes that they have capabilities to strike the vast majority of the nuclear facilities, but there is one specific nuclear facility that is deep, deep underground. And the belief is that they would need help from the Americans with specific weapons that Israel doesn't have to be able to penetrate that underground facility. So my guess is as good as yours in terms of when, but we are very, very close for them to them achieving nuclear breakout. And we know that it has been, I mean, if there's one thing you could put on Bibi for the last 30 years of his life, since the early 90s, Bibi has been warning about a nuclear Iran. This is something that is very much on his radar. And I cannot imagine that he would allow Iran to go as far as nuclear breakout. And so I'm sure he is working behind the scenes to try to get a coalition together. And yes, I do not think that the Saudis, the Jordanians, or the UAE are going to help in terms of actual military support, but I think they will help in terms of our return if we needed to land, if we needed to refuel, even though we've now proven we don't have to do that. We've flown not only to Iran, but also to Yemen with the ability to refuel in the air. But if, God forbid, a plane got shot down or something, that we know that we would have a somewhat of a support from those countries in terms of those kind of needs in a potential strike. But they would not be against it. That's I think the more important thing to say. They wouldn't be against it. They wouldn't necessarily participate in it, but they're not going to be against it. Yeah. So we'll see.
There are a number of questions about the West Bank, including why has violence increased so much in the recent time period? Is there anything that Israel can do to control the extremists? What do you think will happen in the West Bank in the near term, in the midterm, sorry?
Yeah, so now the Gaza border is pretty much is well secured. And the Lebanon border, well, we'll see. Again, we're on day 60 of the ceasefire. We'll see how that progresses. But if that remains, then really the focus, and this was what our Minister of Defense, our new Minister of Defense, Yaakov Katz, just said last week, that now we can really focus on the West Bank and on this growing violence. Now, why growing violence? Let's understand that that violence was growing before October 7th and continued to grow after October 7th as extremists in the West Bank feel more emboldened by what Hamas did in Gaza. They feel like they need to support Hamas in Gaza, and that's why we're seeing those increased attacks. And then also, Israel's forces were depleted as a result of what happened. We had to send a tremendous amount of forces to Gaza and a tremendous amount of forces to the north to fight Hezbollah. And therefore, that left us with not as many forces to manage what was going on in the West Bank. And so now we're really setting our sights on the West Bank. And I want you to know that that was also the case pre October 7th. Pre October 7th, most of our forces were actually in the West Bank, which some argue was one of the reasons that, unfortunately, Hamas was able to cause so much damage and so much, really, so many people on October 7th because of that lack of force on the Gaza border versus most of our soldiers being in the West Bank. The West Bank has been an ongoing problem. So what can Israel do? We've been doing it. I mean, and most of the world has been ignoring this, but literally from October 8th onwards, we have been conducting constant counterterrorism operations in places like Jenin and in other cities. I mean, Jenin, we have fully, uh, we've bulldozed all of the major roadways because of IED threats. We have been arresting terrorists nonstop in the West Bank since this all started. And so Israel is making tremendous effort to try to stop these attacks. They've been successful in thwarting many attacks. We have used increased capabilities like we've never used before. We've used Apache helicopters to strike inside of the West Bank, which we haven't done since the Second Intifada back in 2002 and 3. We've used drones to attack from the air. There has been a tremendous increase in what we've been using to try to quell the violence in the West Bank. And that is our primary focus right now. So it's a valid question. Keep an eye out. And I will say, though, the violent attacks from the fringe settler movement as well is not helping because it becomes a tit for tat. And what happens is the Palestinians commit an attack, and then the radical fringe settlers go in and they start to torch homes of innocent people, and then that becomes an excuse for them to then attack again. And now it's this kind of back and forth that's happening. And I'm not in any way trying to say that one is excusable for the other. They're both not excusable. And I also, let me be very clear that if fringe radical settlers stopped doing it, that wouldn't stop the terrorism from the Palestinians. So let's not, I don't want anyone to think that one is reliant on the other. But unfortunately, radical settler violence gives more of an excuse and helps really recruit, helps create anger and frustration that aids in terrorist organizations in the West Bank being able to recruit and inspire more people to go out and commit these terrorist attacks. So growing problem, something we've been watching for many, many years, and hoping that we can kind of pull in now that things are quiet in Gaza and a little bit quiet on the northern front as well.
There are lots more questions here, and there are a bunch around anti-Semitism. I think perhaps maybe another session, if you'd be willing to come back again, we will do that. In the meantime, I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and I want to thank you, Charlotte, for really an outstanding talk and a great Q&A. As always, you were knowledgeable and clear and helpful and super high energy, and we're all learning to listen in faster gear whenever you come on to talk to us. So
I'm
anyway,
sorry, you asked me to slow down, and then I did, and then I don't know if
you
I
did.
stayed slowed
No,
down. I just
it got better. It was great. It was great. And I
record, and you can slow me down if you want. When you
there we
watch the
go.
recording, you can always slow me down. I usually speed people up, but usually with me, you got to put me on 0.75 sometimes. But I also just want to thank you, and I want to thank all of the organizers and all of the sponsors. This is such an amazing program, and I always love to be a part of it. So thank you for all the effort that you all put in to get such an amazing turnout. And I just endless thanks. So thank you so much.
Thanks. So wait, before you all leave, I want to thank all of you, obviously, again, also for coming. But before you leave, would you please all take out your cell phones and turn your cameras on? Turn on your cameras, turn on your QR code readers, and I want you to consider doing 3 things before you leave. There are 3 things. The first is, if you enjoyed this program and would like to support it, you're invited to donate using the QR code that's now on the screen. There's also a link posted in the chat, and any contribution, great or small, would be appreciated, and please know that your gifts are tax deductible. And while you're thinking about donating, I want to thank Beth Am Jayak for presenting today's programs, and thank all of our co-sponsors, the Congregation Beth Ami Israel Committee, Congregation Beth Jacob, Congregation Kolamet, Jewish Silicon Valley, and the Z3 project of the Ashman Family JCC. So that's the first thing. Please consider donation. The second thing is you can use your cell phones to register now for Jayak's next program, which is going to be on March 27th. Our guest speaker will be Ted Deutsch, who is the CEO of AJC. He also served for 12 years as a congressman with major roles, including co-founding the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, chairing the House U.S. Ethics Committee, chairing the Middle East Global Terrorism Subcommittee. Anyway, Ted is going to speak about U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, what steps have been taken, and what will the new administration do. Attendance is free, advanced registration is required. More information is available on Beth Am's website, which you can find at that QR code and the link that's in your that's in the chat. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is the World Zionist Congress election is coming in March. The result has far-reaching implications for Israel but for not just for Israel, for all of us as well. The effect of the results of the election will affect the allocation of over $1 billion annually to support Israel and world Jewry. It will also affect very important policies such as who's counted as Jewish, who can make Aliyah, what settlements will be increased, will settlements be increased or decreased, will conservative and reform summer camps or just Orthodox summer camps receive Israeli counselors and funding, will LGBTQ marriages continue to be recognized, all sorts of things that are very important and fundamental to all of our values. You can learn more about the elections by clicking on the link in the chat. It's important that everybody vote. If you're 18 years or older and you self-identify as Jewish, you can stand up for your values and make a difference in this election. So please consider voting, and you'll probably be hearing more from us or from your congregations about the World Zionist Congress election between now and March. And last of all, just a reminder, you will all get an email next week with the links of today's program, the links that we've shared, and hopefully Charlotte's going to send us the link to the Palestinian talk that she promised us. Great, thank you very much. And so we'll include that in the link in the email that we send out to you next week. Please keep an eye on it, and if you don't get it in the next week or so, please make sure and check your spam folder. That's it. Thanks again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.